Good evening, everyone. I'm Rob Hubert. I'm the Director for the Center for Military Security and Strategic Studies, and may I welcome you here for our continuation of our Highlander talker series, which, again, as I always point out, we have some of the very best and brightest minds coming forward, and I'm sure you're going to find out very shortly that today is, of course, a continuation of that theme. I have absolutely nothing written about our speaker coming because she is just such a fascinating figure in terms of being able to talk about the issues that we have before us. Her name today is, of course, she's the director of the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary, which is, of course, as many of you have seen in the news, has emerged as one of the most important institutes in Canada to try to understand some of the economic relations that we are facing with the Americans. And they were very successful in being able to acquire funds from the provincial government to assist them in this context. The stuff that they will be producing from that study is going to be probably nation leading in terms of understanding exactly what is happening on the economic side with Canada. And so for those of you that haven't ever had the privilege of seeing Martha's work before, pay close attention to what is going to be coming out of the School of Public Policy on that, because it's basically that important in terms of what is coming. Martha has had a vast career. She has, of course, been willing to do public service. She has been the head of the Canada West Foundation. As I said, she's now the head of the school. She has some incredibly brilliant ideas in terms of how we understand the broader issues of security for Canada. So again, in keeping with the overall context of the Highlanders talks, which are, of course, to bring the very best of the minds of thinking in terms of various elements of security, we're very happy to be able to host Martha. So Martha, without further ado, please.
No. Can I go home now after that? No pressure. Jeez. Anyway, thanks, Rob. You're way too kind. No, I don't want this. Is that okay? Yes. Thank you so much. That was very sweet. Totally wrong, but really kind. He did get it right. I am head of the School of Public Policy at the university, and I was at the Canada West Foundation. I actually retired from a job at Suncor. I was the Chief Sustainability Officer, and the opportunity at the School of Public Policy came up. And I actually live in Calgary because of the School of Public Policy. When Jack Mintz first started it, he asked me to be an executive fellow, which I did, because one doesn't say no to Jack. And that was 15 years ago, and right at the early time of the school. And I was in Toronto, I was working in Toronto at the time. I came out occasionally and fell in love with Calgary and ended up moving out here not that long thereafter. So seeing the opportunity at the school was a little bit like coming full circle. But like I said, I'd tried to retire, and I thought, this is great. What a perfect job. And it's at a university, and I'm going to love this. And then Donald Trump got elected. There is nobody in the world of public policy in Canada who is just sitting around not doing much these days, I can tell you. It is wild. I actually, as an example, I had joined a group called very humbly called, the expert group on Canada-U.S. relations. It wasn't my name, but what the heck. And we started it actually 4 or 5 years ago. It was mostly trade people, trade experts, a number of sort of North America people. Carlo Dade, who is running the New North America Initiative, I think you just mentioned. And he and I have both been on that part of this group for the last number of years. But we started it because we knew that the USMCA was going to come up for renewal in 2026. And so we wanted the Canadian government and others to be prepared for what was likely going to be, kind of run-of-the-mill, but important discussions, because the trade arrangement between our two countries is so important. Then Donald Trump got elected. So it's a really extraordinary time, and I think that's why I'm here. And I really appreciate the invitation. It really is an honor. Before going into all hell has broken loose and the country's in deep trouble. And I'll try not to swear. That was close. I actually do want to just, and a part of it is because we just did Remembrance Day. It's really kind of emotional for me to be in a place like this because I do have a lot of military history in my background. I have 3 great-granduncles that died in World War I. I don't know how many of you saw Saving Private Ryan, but my great-great-grandmother was one of the people, bless you, who unofficially prompted that story because 3 of her sons were killed, and she had a 4th about to go into battle. And I've seen some of the letters and some of the efforts she went to keep that kid out, and it was just extraordinary. He did manage to survive, but that was a very interesting time for our family. But and during World War I, my grandfather flew with Billy Bishop against the Red Baron. He came home and stayed in the civil aviation service, and I like to brag he has commercial pilot license number 1. He doesn't have it. He's long since passed away, but which sounds really good, but it's really because he was the guy giving them out. It's quite cool. I actually have a photo, number 1. Anyway, but he earned it, and he came home and I like to say my mother was the first woman to land at the Billy Bishop Airport in Toronto. And people say, wow, she was a pilot. And I said, no, she was 10 years old, but she was flying with her dad. And they were, planning the runways and doing all that stuff. But he had a son. So one of my mother's brothers was also a pilot in World War II and did not come home. He went down in the Sea of Burma. And my dad, so different family, was one of the ones who landed on D-Day for Canada and was one of the ones who helped liberate Holland. And we went over to Holland when I was a kid, and because he stayed for a while afterwards. Obviously, you couldn't get everybody to come home at the same time. And he stayed with a family who helped him finish his engineering degree. And so when he came home, he then, because of the veterans' support for academic efforts, he ended up at Harvard, which was really cool. But it was he didn't talk about it a lot, as you can imagine. But I say it now because it was just, I had these conversations with my kids just a few days ago, as you can imagine, and they were asking, oh, do you have that picture of Granddad? He was awarded the Military Cross, Field Marshal Montgomery, cool story. He had the choice of getting the award from Montgomery or from the King, and he chose Montgomery, which I thought was also telling. And we have a really cool photo of that presentation. But it's just really important to remember. And we have in his materials a letter from a woman to whom he had obviously written. So he was head of a platoon, and this clearly was somebody, part of his group, who had been killed. He had clearly written to this family, to the woman, to tell her about her son's death. And we just had her response to him, and it was just like, I'm almost going to cry now, right? But it really hit home, Anyway, so I am really grateful. And then I had another uncle. I said to somebody, I have air, land, and sea. I do have an uncle who was too young to join World War II, but he ended up in the Navy as a naval pilot and stayed in the Navy for his career. So all 3 of them. So yeah, it's a huge honor for me to be in a place like this because this stuff's just so important, and it isn't just a Remembrance Day thing. It's so important. Anyway, sorry to get kind of maudlin, but I did want to say thank you for the honor of being here for this. So yeah, the country's gone to hell in a handbasket. I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction, then talk about the economic challenges, Then I'm going to talk about the defense challenges and foreign policy, and then a little bit about what we are doing and what we hope to be able to accomplish. So first off, I want to say, I've joked a little bit about, well, Donald Trump got elected. Clearly the world changed. And it was really interesting to see Canadians putting up their flags, right? Like putting flags outside their houses, draping them on their front porches, putting them in the windows. His language about the 51st state, his talk about Greenland. There's no question this was a different world, cozying up to Putin. Doesn't feel quite as bad now as in those first few weeks after the inauguration, but don't kid yourselves. This is a really bad time for us. And we cannot trust our, up until recently, completely trusted neighbor and ally. We simply can't. And for the people who think, well, he's just nuts, like it'll be okay when he goes. Absolutely not. There was a little while ago, the new Liberal government had a cabinet retreat, or they don't call them retreats anymore. And it came out that they had invited the president of the Heritage Foundation, which some of you might know is the organization in the United States. It's basically an agglomeration, if that's a word, of all sorts of very, very conservative think tanks, organizations. The Heritage Foundation was really behind the Project 2025 work in the United States. And it got out that they had invited the president of the Heritage Foundation. And there was an uproar, right? You had all these Liberal MPs, how dare we invite that guy? And we shouldn't have him up in this country. And why are we listening to this guy? And Carlo, who's the head of the New North American Initiative, and I looked at each other and went, we should have had this guy up 10 years ago. This is part of our problem. We think Trump's the problem. The United States has changed. It's not the same. And yes, we can talk about all of the friends that we have in the United States. And I have lots. I know you all do. Friends, relatives. I have a number of Republican friends that have been friends for decades. The hair is white. We used to get together and have dinners together to talk about politics because we enjoyed having the discussion and debate. And we had Democrats and Republicans and liberals and conservatives. Those dinners stopped a number of years ago. We actually can't have those conversations anymore. The world has changed very much because the United States has changed. And it's not Donald Trump. If anything, Donald Trump is a manifestation of what's happened. And so anybody who thinks that, well, when he leaves, if he leaves, things will return to normal, no. So we have a much bigger task on our hands than we thought we did. So, in terms of an introduction and a table setting here, we have a lot of work to do. And I have to say, all the Canadian flags, awesome, elbows up, tariff wars, oh my God, we've got to deal with economic issues, we have to, diversify our trade. This has been true for decades. The fact that Donald Trump has woken us up to the fact that we are too dependent on the United States is important. But there are two major economic challenges facing Canada. One is tariffs. And frankly, if you across the board, the tariff impact is anywhere between 3 and 5%. I know it's really hard on steel and it's really hard on aluminum, and there's some folks in the auto sector who are really worried. But the Canadian economy as a whole, in fact, don't tell people I just said that, because we want people to still be worried, right? We still want people. But fundamentally, Trump and the tariffs, ultimately less important than the fact of realizing that we are way too dependent. Now, let's not kid ourselves. Geography is kind of key here. We're not going anywhere and they're not going anywhere. We will always be incredibly tied with the Americans in terms of trade and economics. That's actually been fantastic for us. And if we can continue with a decent relationship, it will continue to be. But what's been really important is we have to diversify. Anybody in business knows you can't rely on one customer. That's a really dumb strategy. So we've woken up. I can't tell you how many interviews I've given in the last, since the inauguration, where I've said, look, I have a really hard time saying thanks to Donald Trump in one sentence. But we have two big problems right now. One of them is Donald Trump, and the other one is our own fault. Our economy is doing badly. Our productivity numbers suck. They are getting worse. We try to compare ourselves to the OECD, even from post-secondary education. We've become so complacent in this country. We keep talking about, well, we're one of the best educated. Actually, we're not. We have over 100 universities in this country giving out BAs. How many do you think are really valuable if you have that many institutions? For 40 million people, we don't have as many masters. We don't have as many PhDs. And yet we continue to tell ourselves these stories, right? Our economy's not doing very well. For the last 10 years, we've done everything we could to actually prevent one of our most important industries, which I keep telling people, this is not an Alberta thing. Energy is not Alberta. Oil and gas is Canadian, right? The contribution that this industry gives to the entire country is massive, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's just in taxes, never say just in taxes, whether it's in manufacturing, whether it's in taxes, whether it's in all sorts of jobs, all sorts of things. There are lots of people who say that the oil sands saved the province of Newfoundland and Labrador because there were people there who were desperate and had no self-esteem. It was people from, my friends from Newfoundland and Labrador will tell me this all the time. Thank heavens. Because that work actually gave people a sense of accomplishment and something, and by the way, a check to send back home to it sounds like a foreign country, not completely. But anyway, so we've struggled from a political perspective, from a regulatory perspective, but I have to say from an attitudinal perspective, this country has become so complacent. And I will talk a little bit about defense, and I will talk about foreign policy, but the economic piece for me is such a driver, right? Even Wab Kinew, and I love the fact, Wab Kinew is the NDP Premier of Manitoba. I'm winging it now, I'm not even paying attention to my notes, so you'll have to, cut me off. But Wab Kinew is the NDP Premier of Manitoba. And Danielle Smith is the very conservative Premier of Alberta. And Wab Kinew a little while ago made a comment and said, look, it's the economic horse that pulls the social cart, which is awesome, great. And I loved it when Danielle Smith publicly called him out and said, I love the fact that Wab Kinew said it's the economic horse that pulls the social cart. An example of, sometimes we can agree on stuff in this country. So I thought that was great. We have a lot of work to do in this country. We've become massively complacent. And I will say, just on sort of more general levels, this is not a partisan comment. I think we've lost a quarter century. I personally think that Brian Mulroney and Jean Chrétien will go down as the best prime ministers of the modern age. I'm extremely proud of the fact that I can, as a Canadian, say that, and they came from two different parties. After they finished their job, and one of the reasons they were in my books was because what they did for the country. They were passionate for Canada. We may not agree with all that they did. In fact, we might disagree with quite a bit of what they did, but they did it for the country, they did it for the right reasons. And frankly, they did actually a pretty good job. And then Paul Martin got into office, and Paul was a friend of mine, and I had a lot of respect for him, still do, sorry. But unfortunately, he had 43 priorities, and when you have 43 priorities, nothing actually gets done, and so it was an odd few years under him as Prime Minister. And then Stephen Harper, for a variety of other reasons, I think really no less passionate about the country, but underestimated the growing sentiment of Indigenous unrest, the importance of reconciliation. This I say even though Stephen Harper was the one who did the formal apology. I think there was, in the House of Commons, there still was a missing, just didn't see it coming quite the way it was. And so, you get all these complaints about, well, we haven't built any pipelines in the last 10 years. We didn't build anything in the 10 years before that either. And that's why I say the Harper government underestimated the environmental movement, underestimated the power of the climate movement, and underestimated the really growing sense of power within Indigenous communities. I would say, and protests, protests are really important in our society. Sometimes they go too far, but we've accomplished a lot of really good things in our history because people have stood up and actually said, we need to make change. So I respect that. But we didn't get anything built. And then we ended up with a government that I would say overestimated the climate movement, overestimated, and I have to say this part carefully, didn't overestimate the need for reconciliation and working with Indigenous communities, but I think put an awful lot of emphasis on that. I even have a throat lozenge stuck to the roof of my mouth, so this won't happen. So you'll have to bear with me. I think absolutely the right attitude and the right desires for the country, but when some of these things were done to the exclusion of what we needed so desperately to do from an economic perspective, and I can't tell you how many times I would tell people in Ottawa in the last 10 years, guys, if you want economic Indigenous reconciliation, come and talk to the oil companies in Alberta. Come and talk to some of the companies in Saskatchewan. They've been doing it for years, right? It's been tough, and it hasn't always been perfect, but there were some very hard lessons learned and some really important work being done. I was at Suncor, incredibly proud that was one of the first, was the first actually full equity participation with an Indigenous community. In that case, it was 7 communities, the East Tank Farm. And then we did another one. People in central Canada have no idea that this stuff was happening, and they were still treating this as it's a charity, right? We have to, so we've moved incredibly far, and I think it's really good. But I just want to reinforce that in the last 10 years, there was focus on other things, frankly, to the exclusion of the fundamental economic prosperity that we needed to pull the cart. So, nonpartisan, all I can say is that I'm cautiously optimistic because I think we have a government that's more realistic about how we need that economic horse to pull that cart. There's no less desire for the importance of the social cart. It's just understanding we have to pay for it. So I think we've had this swing in the last 25 years, and as a result, and I'll talk a little bit about this, the last 10 years in particular, we've done ourselves real damage in terms of reputation. Investors, both Canadian and foreign, look at our country and go, you can't get anything done. You keep changing your minds. You decided you were going to do Northern Gateway, and then you said, oh, but no, we're not. We're talking billions of dollars. We had almost 20 LNG projects on the books with an awful lot of potential investment, and they weren't going anywhere. We have so many investors in so many countries around the world that just said, we're not doing this. When it takes as long as it does to get a building permit, when it takes as long to build anything, we've lost an awful lot of investment enthusiasm, domestic as well as external. We've also really managed to lose respect internationally. And I know there are a number of you in this room who know that we've just done a terrible job. We were preaching, we were saying, oh, we're feminist. Well, I got to tell you, as an international relations person, as a trade person, and as a woman, it was, could you please not lead with that, right? We were wagging our finger at countries all around the world. We embarrassed ourselves. There was one example that I used, but this repeated itself in so many different countries. Going over to India and bragging to the Hindu nationalist Narendra Modi about Canada having more Sikhs in our cabinet than Modi had was, I said I wasn't going to swear, so I'm not going to. But, we had negotiated the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and then when we were in Japan trying to ink some of the final bits, made Shinzo Abe wait while we worked it out with some of the others to change it to the comprehensive, I can't even, CPTPP, comprehensive help me with that. It's what are the CPP? Frankly, those of us in the trade world, we only ever still called it the TPP. We were just so offended because it was labor, environment, and all these things that sound lovely, but real politic, you got to understand the rest of the world doesn't necessarily think the way we do. And sometimes we have to understand we may not have the best ideas, and we really may not need to be wagging our fingers. Okay, so back to my notes. Canadian economy, disruption of traditional markets. Duh, that's happened. I did make the point, though, we need diversification, but we will always be intertwined with the Americans. So that relationship, we need to keep it on. By the way, also, too, there are an awful lot of Americans just south of the border, and as I said to somebody earlier, and they have guns. Some of them, a lot of guns, right? So, let's not be so complacent as to not at least be aware of that, right? We have global trade wars. It's not just the Americans, but I have to say, with Trump's behavior with tariffs with the rest of the world, there's almost a good side in the fact that most of the countries around the world that are trade dependent are realizing just how good, actually, a good, solid trading environment globally is. And so hopefully things will, we're already seeing Trump relaxing some of the tariffs on steel. Frankly, that's because Americans are telling him to get rid of the tariffs. We've been saying, and those of us in the trade world have been saying right from the beginning, our best allies on the trade war are Americans. I did not support Doug Ford's ad, and frankly, now that we're hearing frustration at interfering in American politics, I have to say, can you imagine if Donald Trump had taken out an ad in the Globe and Mail and the Calgary Herald, and we would have been pretty pissed off. So, we have to be realistic about how we're approaching these. I mentioned productivity. We're doing a really bad job. We now have the major projects office. When we have some Q&A, happy to answer some questions about that. It has some real pros. It has some cons. There's some uncertainty about, well, what happens to all the other projects that are really necessary for our economy too. So there are a number of things that we're having to deal with. Defense. I'm actually going to talk about foreign policy before I talk about defense. One of the things that was really interesting, we hosted at the School of Public Policy in the University of Calgary, we hosted a major day-long conference tied to the G7 at the time that the G7 was being held here. And Foreign Minister Anita Anand actually asked, she and her people asked if they could come to the school to have a closed-door roundtable. And it was really interesting because she said, basically, we are not going to be wagging our finger anymore. She said, internationally, we have not done well in doing that. And she really said, quite bluntly, we're going to be moving to priorities like economics, defense, military security, other security, cybersecurity. These are the things that are really, really important to us. She said, don't get us wrong, gender equality is really important. But we have to be realistic, and we have to understand with whom we are dealing. I will make that one here. I've got actually her notes from her address, and I think at the UN, and I think it's actually really helpful because it reinforces what she told us that day. In the spring. So this is from September. At our core, our foreign policy rests on three pillars. First, defense and security. Of course, that's fantastic, and everybody in this room would appreciate that. Second, economic resilience, so diversifying trades, strengthening supply chains, being an attractive destination for capital and a trusted trading partner, and working for an advanced rules-based trade. We had that with the WTO, and I really, as I said earlier, I think more and more countries are starting to realize, oh, yeah, that really did benefit us. And so there are some conversations about, the WTO was not going to ultimately work. You can't get everybody to agree. It's just like the UN. But I suspect and watch for more regional agreements, whether they're energy security agreements, whether they're, at some point I said maybe we should do a NATO on energy, obviously not North America alone, But I think we will start seeing more of those, recognizing that we can't rely on one country to be kind of the global protector. We're going to have to do a lot more, and I think Canada, because we are trusted, we're not terribly reliable, and we're not terribly, great for investing, but we are trusted as people, right? When we say we're, generally going to do something. So I think in terms of engaging in some of those alliances, whether they be economic, whether they be security, I said to somebody earlier not long after Trump was inaugurated, and it was really ugly. I mean, that was just Greenland, 51st state, Putin. We were all a little worried, and I was in Australia, and there was talk about, well, should Canada continue to be part of the Five Eyes? And I just said, well, I don't know, maybe we should question whether the United States should be part of the Five Eyes. Like, we were still having the conversations, but as if nothing had changed. But we cannot trust the United States anymore. It hurts me to say that. But we have to be way more self-reliant and resilient, and recognizing that we need to work with other countries around the world, because also we need to be self-reliant, but we're also really small and we're not that strong. And so we actually need to make sure that we have really strong alliances, economic, military, energy, in a number of ways. But it's interesting, Minister Anand on her third, and I want to throw this out, and hopefully it'll raise some questions. Her third was our core values. This I do think gets us in trouble, because I think we love to think we have our Canadian values and that they're more important than anything else. But in her speech, core values, and the first one she said, promoting democracy and pluralism. Singapore is a democracy. Singapore is not a democracy. Singapore is actually a pretty successful country, and we actually stand to do very well in doing more business and more engagement with countries like Singapore. The United States calls itself a democracy. The point being, the word democracy, I think, is unfortunate. If we keep saying we need to make sure that we promote democracy, I think we're ignoring the relationships that we need to have with a lot of different countries. Mark Carney is in the Middle East right now. Not a lot of democracy happening there. We need that relationship with China. We may not like it, but it's incredibly important. My colleague R.J. Johnson has a map where he shows 20 years ago for whom was China their major trading partner. Not very many. Now, and it's every country that is colored in red, China is their first largest major trading partner. It's like the whole world. It is shocking just how economically powerful China has become. We can't ignore that. So when we keep wagging our fingers saying democracy, it doesn't help. So I think we still need to be a little bit careful and a bit more realistic about what we do from a foreign policy perspective. Let me touch on defense. You can tell by my little comment at the beginning about my family history. I have just been appalled for the last number of decades at our I'm not actually getting emotional, it's actually the throat. Here goes another one. So again, preaching to the converted in this room. I am so thrilled to see the Canadian government, I don't care what color it is, I am so thrilled to see a Canadian government realizing the importance. Even, the budget was important, the talk is important, but is it already 2 months ago when Carney increased the pay for our people in uniform? I mean, it's not a lot, but it was awful before. And so so many people I know in this country were just like for decades, oh, but we're peacekeepers. We haven't been peacekeepers for decades. It's like, oh, it's awesome. We're not military. We're peacekeepers. We don't like war. And every time I would hear that, I think, well, yeah, but we wouldn't be here if it weren't actually for a whole lot of people who are willing to actually step up and fight. We don't like it, but it actually comes to be pretty important sometimes. And so not being ready, not having an attitude of support, goodness knows, hanging a few wreaths on one day a year in Ottawa is not support for the military and is not an attitude of recognizing the importance of defense and the importance of our people in uniform. So if this had been a year ago, I'd be ranting about how badly we need this and how important it is for Canada to actually stand for itself and how important it is for us to not rely on the United States. I would have said that even before Trump. But again, this is a thanks to Donald Trump, which is really hard to say. It feels like we're finally getting it. And I know a number of pollsters, Ipsos, Nanos. It is really encouraging. They are really continuing to test the temperament of the Canadian public. And Carney's not going to survive this. Carney's not going to be successful if he does not have public support for what he's doing. It sure feels like he's getting public support. So I think that's really pretty fantastic. I have no idea how long I've gone, so I'm gonna just talk a little bit about what we're doing at the School of Public Policy, because all of these issues are so important to us. So we have productivity. We did a major summit on productivity, two-day summit last October. Trevor Tombe, whom you've heard, read, guaranteed. If you haven't, you're not reading the news. The guy is everywhere, and rightly so. Super smart, really, really thoughtful about this stuff. He's our director of economic and fiscal policy, and he's kind of in charge of our productivity effort. And that summit, 2 days, was fantastic. It then morphed into 6 sub-conferences. We've had 4 this year. There will be 2 January and February. So one was in Ottawa, one in Halifax, one in Vancouver, one in Saskatoon. No, we haven't had Saskatoonian and Halifax. And then we have, we had in Montreal, and then 2 more, one in Saskatoon and one in Toronto, all on different subtopics of productivity. Because honestly, we've been talking about this stuff for years. And so our view with the school and with Trevor is enough about talking. We really have to drill down to what do we need to do to fix some of these problems. And it's been a ride, and watch for it, because we're really excited about what we might have in terms of product afterwards. I mentioned Carl O'Dade and the New North America Initiative. He's our Director of International Policy. The other area of focus for us internationally is the Indo-Pacific. And I think, again, timing pretty perfect, because there's no question we need to have greater allies. I'm part of the Canada-Korea Forum. I've been that for a long time. South Korea is a natural for us to be much closer with, to be engaged much more closely with. So stuff like that is really interesting. So New North America and Indo-Pacific. And come on, Martha, technology. I mentioned R.J. Johnson. R.J. came to us from Columbia University, but before that he had been CEO of the Eurasia Group. I don't know if any of you follow Ian Bremer, who is the current CEO of Eurasia, but they're a global consultancy on geopolitical security. So R.J.'s PhD is in geopolitical security, but he's also become one of the most, if not the most sought after expert on energy policy in North America. Huge thing for him to have come to Calgary. He is Canadian, so he was keen to come back, and so we're really, really excited to have him. And then we established a new area of policy at the school called Canadian Governance Policy, and Anthony Sayers is running that. I sometimes laugh, Canadian governance, or the lack thereof. But that's where we're going to focus on things like interprovincial trade barriers. We're going to focus on a number of, Anthony comes to the role with a fair bit of prov relationship expertise. I'm more interested in the Fed-prov relationship, so stay tuned for that. But I want to end, so yeah, woohoo, we're doing great stuff at the School of Public Policy, and if anybody wants any more information, where to find us, because we really are working at getting the community more engaged. These are really important issues. This is a moment in time for Canada on all of these, and I can't, man, if we do not take advantage of this moment in time for this country to do what we need to do, not because of Trump, but because we need to do it for ourselves, and shame on us. And I have to say, I'm absolutely thrilled, so much for retirement, but I am absolutely thrilled to be involved in a place and a space and a time where we might actually be able to have some impact on ensuring good decisions where we've lacked good decisions for quite a long time in this country. I want to finish a little bit with the idea of service. So I had a conversation with one of the deputy ministers in Ottawa, federal government, a week ago. And this person we were talking about how they're going to actually cut all these civil service jobs, because the civil service in 10 years increased by 43%. It's a whopping number. And it's a lot easier to hire than it is to fire. And so the question has been, how do you do this? You have unions involved. It's going to be very challenging. And this person said, well, one of the interesting things is that an awful lot of the new recruits are younger, 25 to 40, 25, 35. And an awful lot of them, I was told, joined the civil service partly because of the government that was in place in the last 10 years. Back to the values thing, right? Fine, I get that. But, I said, did they understand that the civil service does not actually work according to values? The civil service's job is to pull together what they are asked to do by the government of the day that is in the best interests of the country. Their job is truth to power. Their job is sometimes to do jobs that they don't agree with. I know an awful lot of people in the civil service right now who are concerned about Carney's grammatically it's too late, but his lower focus on climate change, for example. And we're talking about Mark Carney. I mean, Mark Carney is like globally Mr. Climate Change, right? For him to be the Prime Minister of Canada and to say, but actually we think we need a pipeline, is really extraordinary. Personally, having been involved in the Pathways effort, Oil Sands Pathways to Net Zero effort, it's kind of our baby. The fact that he's saying, but we want that to happen, I'm really pleased. I think that's great. We need to do this. We need to be concerned about climate change, of course, but we have a much more realistic Prime Minister. My point being, there are an awful lot of people in the civil service who are kind of worried. Wait a minute, what happened to our values? And so I was having this conversation with the DM, and she said, maybe that will help in terms of attrition. Maybe this will help in not having to fire civil servants. Maybe there will be more of these younger civil servants who are realizing their job isn't to pursue their values in the federal civil service, it's service to the country. And they may not feel as comfortable anymore. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. John Ibbotson and Daryl Bricker just wrote a book called Breaking Point, which is I highly recommend it. And one of the recommendations they have is to move all of the major ministries to different parts of the country. It's sort of been floated before, but he said, no, not just the minister and the deputy ministers and actually physically move the entire shop out of Ottawa. Also said, and maybe relax the bilingual requirement, because 18% of Canadians actually fit that bill, and they're almost all in central Canada. So how do you think we are having this disconnect in terms of understanding Western Canada? Some interesting ideas. Back to the concept of service. I mentioned the letter that was in my dad's stuff, that was from the mom of one of my dad's men who had been killed. And on his watch, right? And a few of my siblings and I were at the 70th D-Day commemoration in Normandy. And I'm going to have to make sure now I might get emotional, especially with all this stuff. And I kid you not, we were standing behind a group of people and my sister overheard their conversation and she said, she went up and she said, "Are you the XX family?" And they said, "Yes." And she said, the Francis XX family? They said, "Yes. Yeah, he was killed here in not long after D-Day." And so there is a point to this story. And she told them that we had a letter from their grandmother. And they said, "Oh my goodness, we have the letter from your dad." And they sent it to us. They sent the letter that our dad had written. And he had beautiful, like they taught people how to write in those days, right? It's just a beautiful script. My dad was 22 years old, and he was writing letters to the families of people who died under his watch. And I'm having this conversation with this woman who is talking about all these young people who have joined the civil service, who are disappointed because it's not now completely aligned with their values. It's not enough on climate change. It's not enough on... And I thought, wow, we have actually lost the concept of service in this country. We were talking earlier about, oh man, I told myself I wouldn't do this. But it's also keeping me from coughing. I haven't even done this, so it's awesome. Great, I should do this more often. But we were talking earlier. I mean, I think we should have a mandatory service, and totally, we were saying it doesn't need to be military. It doesn't need to be. It can be learn how to fight fires, learn how to, yeah, sure, learn how to shoot a gun. But we're Canada. You won't get to keep the gun. We're going to keep the gun somewhere else. But learn how to shoot it, just in case. But I firmly believe we should have national service for a year or whatever. I think that would be really important. But I also just think, and I don't know how to do this, and maybe we just need to talk about it more. I've had this conversation now with my kids. They're in their 40s. Too late for them, probably, but anyway. But I was so struck by that conversation about all these young people who've joined the civil service who were disappointed. And I think, man, oh man, how would you like to have been, in the trenches? In the mud and having to write letters home to people who were killed under your watch when you're 22. I think we've lost that in this country. And these stories just all came together for me in the last couple of weeks, and I've been writing notes to myself. We need to talk about service. We need to talk about service. And we need to understand and we need to talk about what it means to actually be there for your country in whatever way, shape, and form it is. If it's as a civil servant when you have to suck it up and do work for a government whose positions you don't necessarily like, but it's still your job because you're working for you're working for Canada. Whether it's wearing uniform, whether it's not wearing uniform, whether it's, I don't know, volunteering at the food bank. Anyway. Can we end up on a light note? Because I'm realizing that this is just going down. I will end with, I'm actually hugely optimistic about what we can do in this country. Again, thanks to Donald Trump. God, I've said that 3 times tonight. But it's woken us up. It has woken this country up. I just said to somebody this afternoon, I can't believe I'm in the role I have now because it's a moment that I haven't seen in 25 years. We have a chance to do some great things in this country. We have a chance to rally behind whoever is making the decisions to get our economy on board. We want to be able to do what the NDP Premier of Manitoba says and the Conservative Premier of Alberta says and get our economy going again. We have massive potential in this country, right? I say, look, like especially now, there are people around the world who literally would kill for the resources that we have. Let's stop being ashamed of them. Let's actually be really proud of them and do what we can. Let's do what we can for us. Let's do what we can for our allies. Let's do what we can from a global security perspective. We have so much opportunity to do all of this stuff, but it's going to take us. And I keep saying, if we lose this moment, if I'm wrong and Donald Trump leaves and everything goes back to the way it was in the United States and we become complacent again, shame on us. Because, Trump's a problem, but we are a big problem for ourselves. So this is a huge opportunity. And so notwithstanding all my grumpiness and my crying and all that, I am a huge optimist. I am so excited to be a Canadian right now. I am so excited to be in the world of public policy right now in this country because we just have so much to do. And so I will finish with, and I've probably gone on way too long, I'm sorry. But we're excited to be at the school. We're doing some really cool stuff. If there's anybody here who wants to get involved, who is interested in what we're doing, who wants to learn more, we actually have Viviana D'Ambrosio's here. She's part of the school. We have other folks, Viviana in particular, because this is her job, is to actually talk to people about what we're doing at the school. Please don't hesitate. We have a lot of work to do in this country, and we kind of need all hands on deck. So thank you for your patience, for the tears, for the downer, but I hope we finished on a positive note that won't make you regret that you invited me to come. So thank you.
Well, I think it's obvious that Martha has not disappointed and has continued the very important tradition that we have here at the Highlander Talks. Martha will, following in our tradition, will take questions, so please identify. Okay. We'll go through and just, we'll start at the front here. So wait till we get Mary to come by with the what's it called again? Mic. Sorry. Mic, and so because we're recording, and that's why you have to wait for it. Yes, go ahead.
Jeez, I forgot we're recording. I did all that crying.
Yeah. Sorry. I have one question and one just little light comment because I think you need a little bit of a pick-me-up there. So the question is, you didn't say much about our Arctic, which is a large concern of a few of us, especially because we have less trust in that blankety-blank person in Russia than I do in Trump. So I'm kind of curious about, just briefly, where you see us doing more there, because my impression is we're doing nothing.
Thank you so much. I was supposed to talk about the Arctic. That's the problem with winging it, and I'm so sorry. I actually had notes. Okay.
Apologies accepted on behalf of everybody here.
Thank you.
Just go ahead.
So you've given me the opportunity to actually, absolutely. And some of you might know Peter MacKay, who is Minister of Defense for a while, a friend of mine. And we were at a function like at least 10 years ago, and he presented what at that time was known about Russian installations in the Arctic or in the north. It was shocking then. There's also a natural gas production in the Yamal Peninsula. The number of tankers doing LNG, and now they're actually getting to different parts of the world because they've been freeing up some of the areas that the passageways that were closed off by ice, not just because of some warming, but also because they've invested a massive amount on big icebreakers. I mean, it's painful how little we are doing. So we absolutely have to be worried about it. We know that China is, an Arctic, what's the term? An Arctic interested country, even though near Arctic state, please. But it doesn't matter what I think about what they call themselves. They're a real threat. We have to be really careful. So what I come to is when I hear people say, and I hear this all the time, right? Churchill. And that's not even Arctic, but it makes a difference because of a port and the traffic that would happen from that. People have tried to do a port in Churchill, for decades, and it's never going to work. We have to get out of the mindset that it has to be economically viable. I am the first person to say that any major infrastructure project should be economically viable. It should be put on by the private sector to the extent possible. And I've said that if we determine that there are projects in this country that we need to do, that we've decided to do for national security, even in East-West Pipeline, if that's what we decide, let's make that decision. Let's know what the economics are, but at least let's make that decision. Somebody actually, and this is the Arctic thing that I thought was really interesting, we were talking about investing in icebreakers. And there's a couple of different kinds, and one's real super expensive and really good, and we could kind of go with the Volkswagen version. Nothing against Volkswagens, but you know what I meant. But as somebody said, yeah, but how much do we spend in Canada on shoveling snow off of our highways? It's a lot. And if we start thinking in those terms about, well, is what we're doing or not doing in the Arctic as valuable as a highway or whatever, we have to start thinking in those terms. So I suspect we're in complete agreement. We absolutely need to invest way more in the Arctic. Totally agree. The good news is that I really believe that the current government has heard this message a lot. Doesn't mean we get complacent. We have to keep reminding them. But I love those analogies wherever we can use them. How much do we spend shoveling snow?
It's $4 or $5 million in the city every year, I think. And
that's one pity.
So we could buy a few icebreakers with that, yeah.
Well, but isn't that actually an interesting way of looking at it? What do we spend money on?
No,
Nothing against snow, shoveling snow. I actually appreciate.
I understand your point, yeah.
But I think if we can use those kinds of examples that that will resonate with people and make them think about, oh, well, wait a minute, yeah. What are our priorities? Well, the Arctic is absolutely a priority.
Perhaps the best analogy might be something along the lines of saying that we have to be a little bit better than Victoria when it comes to a snowfall.
Yeah, so thank you.
Okay.
So I'm not saying anything controversial because we agree completely,
well,
but I just...
whether you do or you don't, it's okay. Now, I will learn my little light
Right,
point,
yes.
just so because you deal with Yanks all the time, right? So I'm one of these things that thinks there's significant differences between Canadians and Americans. And the way you'll find out is you ask American what the right to bear arms means, and they'll tell you it means own a gun. Mm-hmm. You ask us, we say it's the right to wear a sleeveless t-shirt. There you go.
There was a rule in the House of Commons that you could not actually wear sleeveless. But then there was a time at the House of Commons where there were no women's bathrooms too, so, Thank you for the smile.
Hi, I'm Tim Stapleton. I'm a professor at U of C in the history department. And I'm originally from Newfoundland. And I left a long time ago. And, this is just a quick comment. But, when I grew up, it was poor. And we didn't have a lot of opportunities, and it was a big world out there, and I wanted to see it. Personally, I didn't have low self-esteem, and I never met anyone in Newfoundland who had low self-esteem. And I didn't hear much of your talk after you said that, because you wouldn't say that of other communities. So that's my comment.
Oh, I'll say that about the community that I grew up in. I grew up in Collingwood, Ontario, and when the first free trade agreement was signed, even though I'm a free trader, a whole bunch of the factories moved out because, when I graduated high school there, I had friends who went to the shipyards or to the, Harding carpets or Dull seat belts, and they'd show up in the factory and somebody would say, and they'd punch the clock, and somebody would say, hey, Sonny, we play cards on Tuesdays. It was a very frustrating time, and when all those factories, because they were so unproductive, moved south, Collingwood became the highest welfare town in Canada. There was a lot of lack of self-esteem in my town. I would absolutely say that about other communities. I'm sorry that I offended, but okay.
Thank you. I'm David Phillips. I've got two questions. One is we hear productivity thrown around, And I can understand productivity in a factory, but I can't quite understand productivity on a national basis. That I have trouble getting my head around. So I'd appreciate it if you could explain that a little bit more. And my second question was, I am really concerned about the drift to extremism and the right. And I wonder if our system of governance in Canada is still fit for purpose. Is it actually answering and responsive to the younger generation coming up, or do they just see it as a mechanism for those in power to stay in power?
So both are really tough questions. I'm not an economist. But productivity is not how many hours you work. This is really simplistic. But how much you can get accomplished and its value with the same hours that you work. So if you put in 8 hours sweeping a factory floor, what is that worth ultimately, as opposed to if you have a machine that does the, one of those Zumbas, and it can sweep the factory floor, and your hours can actually be done doing something, more useful, more productive for the organization. That's a really simplistic way of looking at productivity. We want people to spend time that is actually more ultimately per hour worth more. It's really interesting to me. There are some areas that are not productive. The construction industry, interestingly enough, is one of the least productive in the country. They just don't seem to know how to get past having, guys framing, which I used to do actually to put myself through university. I learned how to build houses. The construction, I actually said to somebody the other day, I can't believe it, they finally found a better way to do flashing. Took them decades to come up with something where you didn't have to snip and, the metal and cut your hands. But I kid you not, it's actually a very serious problem. The oil and gas industry is one of the most productive, and you can understand why. Once you've built things, you have pipelines and you have things. You don't have a whole lot of people who are actually doing it, but there's a whole lot of money going through. Another interesting area is agriculture now. The ag tech that is involved now and it's really interesting because some people, you're trying to attract some younger people into these industries. Well, I don't want to go pull carrots. I say, oh man, agriculture now is so high tech and so scientific, and actually, you want to attract people. Say, you want to feed the world? That would be pretty good. So that's fundamentally productivity, but it is really different according to the sector that you're in. Investment is massively important because you can't buy the Zumba vacuum if you don't have the $80 to buy it. So you need the investment in order to buy the technology, to buy the equipment that can allow humans to actually be doing more effective work for the time that they spend. The other one, easy. I think we're all concerned about the drift to the far. I don't even call it the far right. I just call it the far. Because I actually, when I was really young, there had been a significant drift to the far left. I'm old enough to remember, McCarthy, communism. There were some real concerns, and there was some stuff like watching what was happening in the Soviet Union. Scary stuff, right? So I don't call it the far right. I just call it extreme. And I say that also too because a lot of my friends regard themselves as right-wing, conservative, economic, even religious right, but not nutty, okay, not extreme. And we see those extremes. It's not even a spectrum, but it's not just in one place. And it is extremely worrisome. And of course, there's so many younger people who only get their news from Facebook or from their own chat group or their whatever. So yeah, it's a problem. And we're seeing far, far less investigative journalism, democracy, notwithstanding my earlier comments about let's not wag our finger about democracy. I'm actually really bloody proud of being part of a democracy. I actually think it's really important. We have to be careful. But you can't have that without strong investigative journalism. And so we're starting to lose some of the pillars of a society that is well governed. and I use that term importantly. Has anybody ever been on a holiday to the Dominican Republic? Oh no, this is out west. You guys go to, Hawaii and Mexico and, and Arizona and Texas. Well, Cuba and Dominican, they're really more for the folks who are in the eastern part of the country, and I grew up in Ontario. The reason I ask is that if you ever have a chance to go to the Dominican Republic and you fly over the island, the Dominican Republic shares the island with another country called Haiti. The Dominican Republic has done not badly. Haiti is an unmitigated disaster, but they share the same island, the same latitude, the same climate, the same geography. It is the most glaring example of the importance of good governance. So I'm not sure what the answer is, sir. What I do know is that we need to insist on having people run our country who are more focused on good governance than on getting voted in the next election, or who supported them in the past election. The problem, and I will say this, it's not a problem, but one of the challenges of a democracy is that they are dependent on the voters. And the number of voters, the younger voters, all the polls have shown in the last election, the only reason this is not a partisan, it's not, Pierre Poilievre versus Mark Carney, but I think it's telling. The only reason Mark Carney was able to win government was because people with our color hair. Young people are angry and they are looking for alternatives. And I'm just worried that they're looking for alternatives that don't really exist. And I think that's what we've seen in the United States. It's been a bauble, make America great again. But he's not making it great again. So we all wish we had answers to that.
Hi, Martha. Thanks for the talk and thanks for your service. And great hearing stories about your dad, too, on D-Day. My granddad was a mechanic in Bomber Command Group 6, so that was pretty cool. I'm a business owner. I own a business in the tech sector here in Calgary. We're doing everything we can to grow it. There was a very disturbing episode in the previous government when we obviously saw them rise to say that we're going to increase the capital gains tax. And then we saw tech leaders in the country like Tobias Lutke step forward and say this is going to further hinder investment in technology in Canada. The tech sector, in my opinion and the opinion of many of my peers, is something that governments at all levels in this country completely fail to understand. And so my question, I'd like to know your opinion about, to what extent do you feel governments have hindered investment, specifically in tech, but broadly in business, private investment in business, and to what extent should they attempt to correct the course? Should they attempt to intervene and draw that investment into Canadian tech businesses? Thanks very much.
It's such a great question because it's really easy to say, just get out of the way. And there's no question, there have been some bad mistakes made about what we need to do to attract investment. But it's not just tax. Like we tend to, well, let's get that tax credit and let's put this tax on, and big bad corporations, we need to tax them more. But investment is seriously, and you would know this, investment follows return. And if the return is hampered because it takes too long to see the return, if the return is, and in some cases people are worried about, if the return comes from, and this is not a good example for Canada, but if the return, because you use really, really super cheap labor to make your shoes, right? Investors might be worried about that. And there was there have been issues like that in years past with different global companies. But fundamentally, investment's not philanthropy. And I think this is one of the problems from the whole climate change discussion, and I think even Mark Carney, who is trying to rally investment around the world, it's not going to go unless it is philanthropy, and there are some people who will do that, like Bill Gates, but even Bill Gates is now, saying we've got to be more realistic. Investment follows the money. And if you can't make the same amount of money in Canada as you can in the States because it takes 6 months in the States to build something that takes 5 years, yes, we have to get out of the way. And there's no question. I was at Canada West Foundation when the Bill C-69 was put forward. I have scars on my back from that sucker. It's the worst piece of legislation I think I've ever seen. I keep telling people don't talk about getting rid of it because then that'll just look like we're flip-flopping again. Amend it. Let's fix it. There's a lot to be fixed. But that's a really good example of government totally getting in the way. But on the other hand, when things go badly, it's pretty easy to say, hey, can you help us, right? Like, look at the steel industry right now, right? Oh, we need your help. And so I think the business community needs to be consistent in terms of if we want government to help us, understand that government might actually have some requirements that go along with that. But my default would be get out of the way. Yeah, I mean, I've been in business for a long time too, and you can't have just like an unfettered market. We want to protect our environment. We have strong labor laws. We provide health care to employees as part of our government decision. I think that's something to be really proud of, and it does actually help. But for the most part, I'd be the one to say get out of the way. That said, we just had the discussion about national security in the Arctic. Private sector is not going to do that. Not alone. No. If there's... Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah, but that's you and I who pay for that, right? Governments pay for it. So there's no question, but the private sector will do it if they get paid enough to do it, but not because there's an economic return associated with it. So I just think, we have to find that balance. I think we've lost that balance for sure in Canada. I think we're in a position now where we really need to work at finding the balance. Don't even get me started on interprovincial trade barriers.
That was actually my question. What progress is being made on interprovincial trade barriers?
Not a lot. Interestingly enough, when I was at Canada West Foundation, we actually did a fair bit of work on this. And one of the things that we found was really, really interesting. People assume it's politics, right? It's, Newfoundland and Labrador, when the provinces were all coming out saying, oh, yeah, we'll just, willingly, we'll just mutual recognition of everything. And I'm pretty sure it was the Newfoundland and Labrador government said, well, wait a second, we have brewery workers here who want to keep their jobs. They're not the only province, right? Doug Ford was going on and on and on. Well, yeah, we're just mutual recognition. We'll break them all down. And then within a week, he passed a budget that gave tax breaks to Ontario brewers and distillers. I mean, left hand, right hand. One of the things that we learned that I think is really important. And it's a light for me, is that although there is politics sometimes, right? For some things, it's a no-brainer. If you're trained as a nurse in Ontario, for God's sake, you're totally fine in terms of being trained as a nurse in British Columbia, right? Those mutually recognized professional qualifications, those should be easy. And I actually think there is progress being made on that. When it comes to other things, we learned that the biggest problem is that the provinces don't know what the other provinces have. It's not, I don't want to let those construction workers in here, although that's true for Ontario and Quebec. It's, we don't know. We maybe would be happy to mutually recognize toilet seat manufacturing standards, which actually, believe it or not, is a thing. I see you nodding. Yeah, that's a thing, believe it or not. But they don't know. And so what we've proposed and what I'm continuing to try and work on, and have had a couple conversations with the Privy Council office on this, hey, we're a university. We're not actually that expensive. We can hire 10 postdocs, put one in each province, hire them for a year, make a team out of them, and get them and use AI to actually figure out what all the different provinces have in terms of regulations so that we can actually compare. And I think you'll find that in most cases, if there are differences, they're pretty minimal, right? Where there is a challenge, and I use this as a hypothetical, I have 2 grandsons who live in Revelstoke, 5 and 3. And in Revelstoke, if you've ever been there, the Trans-Canada comes in to town and there's a light. But the locals, when they go to cross the Trans-Canada, even if it's a green light to cross, they still stop. Because there's some really big honking trucks that are coming down that road that may not necessarily stop on time. There have been problems. And so, you know, I said, look, if British Columbia is hesitant to recognize truck braking standards from Saskatchewan, there might be a reason. Not to say that Saskatchewan has bad trucking brake, and this is a hypothetical. There are some trucking standard issues in terms of axles and stuff, but I use this because it is hypothetical. I actually would not want my 5 and 3-year-olds to be endangered by a provincial premier who said, sure, we'll take those standards, even though it's really flat there and it's really not flat here. I use that as an example for why sometimes premiers are unwilling to say, sure, we'll just recognize everything. So there is work to do. And it's not, you know, it's not ill will. It's actually, in most cases, a case of we just don't know. And so if there's a way for us, this is why I see there's a light, I think we could do a lot to actually solve this problem. So anyway, University of Calgary, let's go. Let's try and solve one of the nation's biggest problems. But I think we can help.
I understand your point you made about the importance of a relationship with South Korea. Please tell me you said that. I'm also Prophet UFC and I get confused.
Sorry, I coughed. What did you say?
I understand your point about, you said something about the importance of a relationship with South Korea. But now we have the government making this political decision about submarines, and it's between South Korea and Germany. Are we better off economically and certainly from a security point of view if we are facing East versus Western Europe?
Well, one would be a European country and an Asian country, very different parts of the world. I don't think the government is making a political decision based on anything that I've heard. I think they really are looking seriously at the specs of the German submarines and the South Korean submarines. You know, there are people here in uniform who might know more about that than I do, but from what I've been understanding, what can I say is that I think it's a hell of a lot better than us pretending to build them ourselves. Is there some military procurement that we should do more of here in Canada? Absolutely, from a national security perspective. But there are some things we also have to be realistic, and some things where a procurement decision might actually have some who are our allies connotations and considerations. Somebody actually floated the idea maybe we should, because we have 2 oceans, we don't necessarily have a whole lot of interchange between, you know, vessels on the East Coast and vessels on the West Coast. I'm saying this with Rob beside me. I got to be really careful. But there might be considerations to consider dual sourcing, even though, you know, specs, mechanics, maintenance, all that kind of stuff would be different, but of a view that would actually be quite different because they're on, you know, how many thousands of kilometers apart. I struggle understanding that, but it was an interesting conversation to have. But I do think we need to be realistic. I think we really need to think about who do we need to work with now? And I personally believe we need to establish some really strong relationships in the Asia-Pacific region. Australia is there. I think we need to really, really build that relationship. We already have it, but we need to build it. But we also need to expand our horizons a little bit. We haven't in the past because we've had the protector to the south. It's going to take more work, but I think we have to. That was a really non-answer to your question, but hopefully I elaborated with some of the considerations that we need to be thinking about.
Just to add one strategic overlay on the submarines, The South Korean submarine, if you look just purely without the economic but the capability, is much better for hunting out submarines, i.e. going out and looking for the Chinese submarines. The Norwegian German is much better at holding a position and stopping enemy subs from coming through, i.e. Russian subs going for the GIUK gap. If it's a strategic consideration and the government makes it on strategic, you're going to have a very clear indication of what they see as the more dangerous threat. The stopping the Russian subs or going after the Chinese. Because the Chinese, you have to pursue them in the Pacific. And that according to Admiral Topsheet, is the strategic decision. But as Martha has made very clear, the economics will come in as well. I think there was one over here.
Bon, est-ce qu'on peut poser une question en français?
Oh oui, certainement.
Oh, OK. J'ai fait un diplôme en philosophie à l'Université de Calgary, beaucoup des années passées.
Pas trop.
Oui, et non, j'ai l'âge de 64 ans. J'ai fait beaucoup des années passées. Mais une chose que j'ai appris avec ce diplôme en philosophie, c'est l'habilité de parler avec les personnes qui ont des points de vue complètement différents et opposés à moi. Et je peux parler avec pas seulement les libéraux, les conservateurs, mais aussi avec les marxistes et les Trump supporters. Et c'est une habilité qu'on peut développer par l'étude philosophique, et il y a des sujets dans l'université qui enseignent l'habilité de communiquer avec les personnes complètement différentes que soi-même. Mais le problème, c'est si on étudie seulement les choses comme commerce ou science et choses comme ça qui sont très utiles, mais si on
On étudie
si
pas les autres.
si on n'étudie pas les autres choses comme philosophie, on n'a pas l'habilité de communiquer avec les personnes, effectivement avec les personnes qui sont opposées à nos idées. Et donc, on doit étudier plus que seulement commerce et sciences. Les commerce et sciences sont importants, mais il est aussi important de développer l'habilité de communiquer dans une façon respectueuse avec les personnes opposées à nos points de vue.
Non,
Merci beaucoup.
c'est complètement correct. Je suis complètement d'accord. Est-ce que ça va si je réponds en anglais?
No problem. I mean,
Okay.
my English, my French, to francophones, they'll notice all my mistakes. So yeah, happy to hear the answer.
I did another interview today in French. They're picking on me now because there aren't that many people in Western Canada who can speak about the energy business in French. And frankly, I think I give them sometimes a point of view that they don't necessarily get normally. So I think they're enjoying it. I'm paraphrasing, but the point being it's so important to be able to communicate with people with whom you disagree or who disagree with you. And how, from a university perspective or an educational perspective, science is awesome, engineering is awesome, economics are awesome. But this lovely gentleman studied philosophy and was saying how important it is if you really want to be able to communicate, that you need to have a broader education, including things like philosophy, or I would say history, or I'm elaborating now, but some of those things make it, it's important to have those as well so that you can actually communicate with people of different views. Can I add, what I've learned is that you can't communicate with anybody unless and until they're actually willing to hear. And I've heard so many times said, well, you just don't understand, or you just don't, communication is the responsibility of the communicator. And if somebody is not getting it, say, you're not getting it, that's not their problem. You're not understanding how to communicate with that person. And we certainly found this in the energy industry. I mean, my gosh, you know, trying to explain to people what was happening and the value of oil and gas to Canada. Even if, as I was working on the Pathways project to reduce emissions drastically in the production of oil in Canada, which we thought was really important to do, and still do, as soon as you said the word oil, right, especially in certain parts of the country, and realize just even with the varied educational background that I have, you have to understand what the other person is thinking about. You have to understand what the other person is worried about or cares about before you can actually even start to address that. But as soon as you start to do that, and so one of the things we did with Pathways was to, and of course the lawyers got in the way, but the ad campaign that I wanted to do when we first started was to do an ad campaign saying, hi, we're the oil sands. We are the biggest emitters in Canada. We're a big part of the problem. Because that would have actually had people on the environmental side, oh, they just acknowledged it. But it would have opened some doors. The first ads were sort of like that, but like I said, the lawyers got involved, and I can actually be critical of lawyers because I am one. So you know, I feel more comfortable being critical of them because I am one. But it's a really big challenge. I mentioned our friends. That we used to have political dinners all the time of all different political stripes. There comes a time when no matter how hard you want to and how hard you want to try, it is deeply troubling to me that this group of friends can't talk with each other anymore, and we just can't. Once they got into the mega thing, it got be really problem. But thank you. It's a really valid comment. Thank you for that. And merci beaucoup.
We're getting towards the end. We can take maybe one or more questions. There's one over here.
The man who knows about toilet seats. I kid you not, actually, the number of different regulations we have in this country for building things. And if we worry about not having the American market, we don't even have a Canadian market, right? Like if you can't sell a toilet seat that's manufactured to Ontario standards into Alberta, you're kind of limiting your market. And so we can't enjoy economies of scale. If we can't benefit from economies of scale, we can't compete internationally. Like these are real problems. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
Object. We need open rings in the toilet seats. My question is more along the lines of, we talk about, we've got rare earths up the yin-yang and how they're so important and they'll drive our industry and that sort of thing. The average mine to production in Canada is somewhere between 28 and 30 years. The technology won't even be the same by the time we get something done there. Like, what's our problem?
Man, if we had the answer. Actually, we do have some of the answers, and I think with the major projects office, I think there are attempts being made. My colleague, R.J. Johnson, I mentioned him before, he just did a presentation yesterday. And in his presentation, he has quite a focus on critical minerals, and he has some really interesting stats. Copper is still huge. We actually do, that. He said nickel is very interesting. We have done well in nickel in Canada, but we're in the Sudbury area, but not further north. And he said, and interestingly enough, the demand for nickel has plummeted. So one of the challenges with, any mineral, critical minerals, rare earths, there are two big parts of the equation. One of them is mining. There are three. One of them is mining, one of them is transporting to the processing, and the third is processing. We all have heard about China being a global powerhouse in terms of critical minerals. They don't actually mine a ton of their own, but they are absolutely monopolizing the processing. And so one of the reasons it takes that long to build a mine in Canada is that you have fits and starts. As soon as there's a particular mineral that looks like it might be economically viable to do a mine, the Chinese have quite a long history of then dropping the price so that globally it becomes not economically viable to do the mine. We are totally dependent on the Chinese processing capability. It's one of my, I tried to end optimistically. Now you're making me go down a, but it's one of the reasons why, even if it's not economically viable, this is one of the examples where maybe we need government taxpayer support for some of this infrastructure and some of these efforts, because not like from a national security perspective, from a global security perspective, we have a lot of that. We could be helpful not only to us but to our allies, and we desperately need to move away from the monopoly of China. I mean, I don't know the exact number, but it's shocking how much of the mineral production we have in Canada actually goes across the country, then to China, and it's Canadian minerals that are being processed in China. So actually, RJ yesterday even made the point, maybe we should consider a smelter in Alberta. And we all know about white elephants in this province, but there might be other reasons to actually do something like that. And those are the kinds of conversations that I think we're now hopefully having because the world has changed. Okay.
I'll save this throughout a little bit. Outstanding. And thank you for that. Just before I get into the conclusion, I'll point out one of the events that we are also working on is to be holding a conference on critical minerals and security. Beyond Martha, we also, in the School of Public Policy, we have some of the leading experts in Canada. Elizabeth Stern over at the Faculty of Law, Heather Exner-Perront, another graduate from, if you're following the critical minerals, those are names that you need to be watching in the context of what's happening. And so, you know, we don't have a date yet for when we're doing this, but we will be doing it probably sometime next year. We could do it this year, can't we, Mary? No, I'm just kidding. Mary gets upset when I commit us too far. Anyway, what can I say? I mean, I can see that the discussion probably could continue on well, the intensity. I think what we saw here, of course, is the importance of these type of gatherings and discussions. Martha's absolutely right. We need to be able to discuss, to talk these issues, even if we don't agree with each other, because otherwise we go the route of her dinner party. And basically, the only thing that comes out of that is that you don't see people anymore, and you just solidify the very extreme positions. In other words, if you don't talk to each other, both sides, left, right, it doesn't matter what the normative is, you go to the side. So I think that we've been very privileged tonight to not only have an outstanding talk within the actual formal presentation, but when you think about the consideration of what we are up, Martha's absolutely right. We are at a time of great inflection, and as a country, we behooves us to have these grown up and very serious discussions right now, because if we don't, we are headed for a lot more hurt. So I'd like to thank Martha for, once again, just providing within the context of our speaker series here is just an outstanding. I mean, the personal reflections, you could hear a pin drop as Martha is explaining some of her family connections. And I think it just illustrates the fact that these aren't esoteric topics. These are topics that are affecting each and every one of us. So I'd like to take the time, first of all, to thank Martha for coming out and sharing and pushing us and provoking us on what we need to be thinking. I also like to thank the audience for your participation, for coming out, listening, sharing, because in these very dangerous times, this is the way that we find our way forward. Just two small commercials, as I said, on January 22nd, and this relates to those of you that are interested on the Arctic. We have one of Canada's leading experts on the Arctic will be coming to talk, Dr. Whitney Lockenbarrow. And those that are, in fact, interested in terms of going beyond the peacekeeping, how, in fact, the forces are able to deal with these very uncomfortable truths, a disconnection with the Americans, but a growing threat from our adversaries. We'll be having a 2-day conference on land power. Chris Hunt, who's in the audience here, right here, is helping us organize in terms of that particular. You can go to our website and find all of these events. So, Martha, audience, participants, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you. We will be having the similar, Martha, of course, your throat may not last, but she'll probably sit around if you want to informally at least get the card to find out what the school is doing. So thank you very much. We still have food, drinks.